Some movies get remembered the way audiences first met them, and that's the end of the story. Others have a buried version of themselves underneath, an earlier draft, a different cast, a different ending, a tone the audience never actually saw. Pretty Woman is the second kind. The polished romantic comedy that played in theaters in 1990 grew out of a script with a different name and a much darker direction, and almost every layer of it was reshaped on the way to the version that became one of the era's defining films. Here are 24 secrets the picture quietly carries inside it, starting with the one that rewrites what kind of story it nearly was. Number 1. The darker script behind the film. The romantic comedy audiences hold up as the defining Hollywood fairy tale of its era didn't start anywhere near a fairy tale. It grew out of something almost unrecognizable. Before it became Pretty Woman, the screenplay carried a different name. J.F. Lawton wrote his original draft under the title 3000, the sum Vivian was paid for her week with Edward. That version played as a hard urban drama, not a romance. The tone was harsher, the world rougher, and the ending landed far closer to the bleak reality of what such a week would actually look like for someone in Vivian's position. The studio sweetness audiences eventually responded to wasn't anywhere on the page. Much of the recognizable architecture was nevertheless already in place. The opera sequence existed in the early draft. The boutique humiliation existed. The shape of Vivian and Edward's 7 days. The rhythm of their negotiation. Even a number of the most quoted exchanges all lived inside the colder script first. They survived a long rewriting process that softened nearly every surface around them, while the spine stayed intact. The bones of the film audience's love were laid down in a story almost no one from that audience would have wanted to sit through. Number 2. Why the Lotus got the part. Edward's white sports car cuts a low, sharp silhouette through the early morning Beverly Hills shots, and within seconds the audience knows everything they need to know about him. Money, speed, detachment. The car does in a single frame what a paragraph of dialogue would otherwise have to do. That car almost wasn't a Lotus. The more obvious choices, the brand's American audiences would immediately associate with upper-end luxury, backed away from the project once they read what kind of film they were attaching themselves to. Pretty Woman's subject matter, especially in its earlier and harsher phase, made the safer luxury brands hesitant to put their badge on Edward's hood. The Lotus Esprit stepped into the gap, simply by being available when the more conservative options weren't. The decision read at the time as a fallback. It looks now like one of the production's small accidental masterstrokes. The Esprit's profile is sharper and stranger than a Mercedes or a Jaguar would have been, and that strangeness gave Edward's first few minutes on screen a slightly off, slightly out-of-place quality that fit the character better than the obvious choices ever could have. A piece of marketing reluctance ended up shaping some of the film's visual personality. Number 3. Julia Roberts' no nudity rule. Julia Roberts arrived on the production with a clear line drawn around her own work. She would not perform nude scenes. The decision was hers, made early and held firmly, and it shaped how every revealing moment in the film would eventually be shot. The practical solution was a body double. Shelley Michelle stood in for the more exposed material, allowing those scenes to carry the visual information the script needed without crossing the line Roberts had set. The arrangement was unfussy, the kind of working compromise that disappears from a finished film when it's handled well. A viewer focused on character has no reason to notice it at all. The context around that decision matters. Roberts was 21 when production began. She had only just started becoming the kind of star she would soon be, and she was holding a firm position about her own image at a moment when the industry would not necessarily have rewarded that resistance. The boundary held anyway, and the choice she made before her first day on set quietly shaped a career that was still ahead of her. Number 4. How Disney softened the story. There's a common assumption about how Pretty Woman ended up softer than its origins, that the studio fought to preserve the harder version and was somehow overruled. The chronology runs the other way. J.F. Lawton's grittier 3000 draft existed before Disney's Touchstone label took the project on, and the studio's choice to develop it at all was a choice to commercialize it. Once the project sat inside their slate, the push moved firmly towards something accessible, a romantic fairy tale tuned to broad audiences, rather than a hard urban drama tuned to none of them. That repositioning was the studio's contribution and the studio's call, and it set the direction the rest of the production followed. The warmer texture and the actual emotional reading of the central pair came from somewhere else entirely, and the production wasn't finished reshaping the picture yet. Number 5. The stars who almost got cast. 4 actors. That's how many other names sit on the public record of who was attached to, considered for, or reportedly approached about the 2 leads before casting finally settled. Al Pacino circled the part eventually played by Richard Gere. Burt Reynolds and Sean Connery were each in the conversation around the same role at different points. Michelle Pfeiffer's name has been raised in connection with Vivian. Each of those alternate worlds points toward a noticeably different film. Pacino or Connery in Edward's chair would have pulled the picture closer to the colder original. Pfeiffer in Vivian would have changed the chemistry's entire frequency. A different kind of warmth, a different kind of vulnerability, a different shape to the laugh that ends up doing so much of the film's emotional work. The version that reached audiences depended on a casting outcome that came together far later than anyone outside the production probably realized. Number 6. The 3-word note that sealed the deal. Please say yes. Those are the 3 words that closed the deal. Written on a small note, Julia Roberts slid across the table to Richard Gere during one of the early meetings about the project. He had not yet committed. Gary Marshall was working hard on him, lining up arguments, but the script in Gere's hands, closer at that point to Lawton's 3000 than to the eventual romantic comedy, wasn't an easy sell to a leading man with quieter, more deliberate instincts. Roberts came into the meeting with no particular strategy beyond the note. The way Gere has told the story since, that gesture did more for the project than any of the formal pitching in the room. Gere has also said openly that he hadn't yet figured out who Edward was. The character on the page didn't fit him cleanly, and the fuller sense of the role only arrived through the work itself and the conversations with Marshall that followed. The casting that became the film's emotional center came together less from a leading man's certainty than from a young co-star willing to ask plainly for what she wanted. Number 7. How Roberts prepared for Vivian. In the months before Pretty Woman went into production, Julia Roberts spent time inside a Los Angeles free clinic where Gary Marshall's wife, Barbara, volunteered. The clinic worked with women whose lives intersected the world the script had drawn carefully around its margins. Roberts wasn't there to research a costume or pick up a surface behavior to perform. She listened. She talked with the women who came through. The film's idea of who Vivian was, how she carried herself when she wasn't switched on for a client, what her boundaries were, what she might know about the people around her that no one else in the story did, was assembled from those conversations rather than imagined into being. The brief, almost quiet moment in which safer sex practices appear in the script reads as one of the production's small tells, a deliberate choice to keep at least one foot in something true, while the rest of the film was being lifted into its glossy register. The result is a Vivian whose charm has real weight under it. The sparkle and the timing got the attention, but the reason the character holds up across rewatches is the work that happened before any cameras were on her. Number 8. How Marshall turned it into a fairy tale. There's a quality in how Pretty Woman lands tonally that doesn't come from the script as written. It comes from a director with one foot deliberately planted in the fairy tale tradition. Gary Marshall took the framing further than the studio had asked for. He read Vivian as a contemporary princess in a tower, treating the hotel suite as the tower, the elevator as the climb, and Edward's arrival as the version of the story where the prince has his own emotional rescuing left to do. He read Barney, the hotel manager, as something close to a fairy godmother, the figure who helps the princess become recognizable. None of this was on the page in 3000. None of it would have survived a less generous director. Marshall wasn't ignoring the harder material underneath. He was looking through it for the shape of a different story. Where the studio repositioning set the destination, this layer of work was about which path the picture took to get there, and that path was the one Gere would have to walk without letting Edward's stillness read as cold. Number 9. How Gere built Edward from nothing. On the page, Edward Lewis didn't quite work. The script had the surface of him, the mergers and acquisitions career, the cold habit of buying companies just to break them apart, the suit and the suite, but the interior was almost blank. The performance had to be built inside that gap. Gere has said in retrospect that he was still figuring out who Edward was as production went on, and that Gary Marshall's direction was a kind of permission to do less rather than more. The instruction, in its simplest form, was to stay still, don't reach, don't perform. Let Edward be a man whose rules are mostly about not letting other people see what he's actually feeling. The push-pull rhythm with Vivian her warmth meeting his restraint, her openness pulling against his closed posture, became the load-bearing dynamic of the romance, precisely because Edward refused to do the emotional work for her. The reason audiences end up rooting for Edward at all lives in that stillness and in the listening, rather than in any of the bigger gestures most films would have reached for instead. Number 10. The two body doubles behind the poster. For decades, viewers have argued about whose body actually appears on the iconic Pretty Woman poster. The cropped torso in the cutout dress, the legs, the angles. The answer involves not one body double but two, and they did entirely different jobs. The promotional image audiences memorized was a composite. Donna Scoggins supplied the body and the legs. Julia Roberts' face was placed onto the final image during post-production, producing the version that ran on every poster, sleeve, and display reel for years. The poster was a manufactured object, not a candid frame pulled from the film. Inside the picture itself, the credit goes to someone else entirely. Shelley Michelle stood in for Roberts in scenes requiring more revealing material, working within the boundary Roberts had set. Two women, two distinct functions, and one surprisingly long-running confusion about which of them did what. The image audiences associate most strongly with the picture turns out to be a face placed onto someone else's body. Number 11. How the costumes told Vivian's story. The red dress moves first. Long velvet sleeves, deep neckline, gloves to the elbow, diamond at the throat. Vivian on the way to the opera is the moment Pretty Woman stops being a comedy of class and becomes a fairy tale about transformation, and the costume does most of that work before a single line of dialogue lands. Costume designer Marilyn Vance built that look with the kind of conviction that survived studio resistance. The red opera gown almost wasn't red. Vance fought for the choice over alternatives the production nearly defaulted to, and she has been clear in interviews since that the color was the entire point. The boldest possible visual signal that Vivian had crossed into a world she wasn't supposed to belong in. The design tracked her arc deliberately. Early in the picture, the costumes are loud and exaggerated. The boutique day moves her towards something cleaner. The polo match places her in something carefully off-key. The opera moment lands her in the gown that announces she has arrived, even if she hasn't. What Vance accomplished sits closer to character writing than wardrobe. The way Vivian carries herself across the picture changes more visibly through clothing than through almost any other element of the production, and the red opera gown alone has become one of the most recognizable garments in romantic comedy history. Number 12. The piano scene that wasn't in the script. He asked me what I do in hotel rooms alone at night, and I told him I play piano when I can't sleep. Richard Gere's account of how the piano scene ended up in the film comes back, in every retelling, to that single exchange with Gary Marshall. The scene didn't exist in the script when that conversation happened. Marshall took the answer back to the writers almost immediately. The scene was added, and the music Edward plays in the hotel lobby in the middle of the night is Gere's own improvisation, the actor pulling something genuine from his own life, and the camera finding it there. That's why the moment works the way it does. The music isn't trying to do anything except sit with Edward, and the way Vivian comes to him under the piano belongs to a different register than nearly anything else in the picture. One of the film's most remembered romantic beats exists because a director asked an honest question and trusted the answer. Number 13. The necklace laugh was unscripted. On set, Gary Marshall snapped the lid of the velvet jewelry box shut on Julia Roberts' fingers as she reached for the necklace inside. The startle and the laugh that followed weren't in the script, weren't rehearsed, and weren't Roberts' plan at all. The take ran, and the laugh audiences have remembered for decades is the genuine reaction of an actress whose director chose to surprise her on camera rather than ask her to perform surprise. What that small jewelry box moment does in the film is broader than the gag itself. It briefly turns luxury comic, lets Vivian be the one in the room responding most honestly to it, and lands the richest object in the scene as the funniest one. Marshall had a habit of building moments out of accidents he engineered himself, and the necklace snap is the clearest example of that instinct the picture has. Number 14. The deleted scenes that made Vivian harder. There's a version of Pretty Woman audiences have never quite seen, not because it was lost, but because the editing of the theatrical cut quietly trimmed it away. Several scenes that survived rough drafts and even shooting didn't make it into the final film, and the picture audiences received is meaningfully softer than the one that came out of production. The cuts all pulled in the same direction. Rougher beats pushed toward comfort, sharper edges sanded down, moments emphasizing the precariousness of Vivian's life, replaced by beats emphasizing her transformation. Some of the energy from Lawton's earlier drafts had survived all the way through to dailies and only got fully removed in the cutting room. The decision wasn't about hiding difficult material so much as protecting the tone the studio and Marshall had been carefully building across every other stage of the production. It leaves an open question. Pretty Woman, as audiences know it, is the version that chose warmth over weight. Whether a cut with more of Vivian's edges still showing would have endured the same way is something only a future restoration could genuinely answer. Number 15. Why the opera choice wasn't an accident. The lights go down, the curtain rises, and the opera Vivian is watching is La Traviata, Verdi's adaptation of a Dumas story about a Parisian courtesan who falls in love with a young aristocrat and is forced to give him up because of the gulf between her world and his. She doesn't know the plot when she sits down. By the time the third act arrives, she's crying. The choice of opera is doing far more work than a glamorous date scene needs to do. La Traviata isn't just any tragic opera. It's specifically the one whose central woman is in the same position Vivian is. Both stories follow a woman trying to cross a class line through love. Both involve a man who must decide whether his world's rules matter more than the woman in front of him. Vivian's tears are not a generic reaction to a sad opera. The film is showing the audience that Vivian recognizes herself on that stage, in the body of a courtesan whose love story ends badly because the world doesn't yet have room for it. Pretty Woman, unlike La Traviata, gives its protagonist the ending the opera withholds. The scene becomes a mirror Vivian briefly looks into and then chooses to step away from. The film tips its hand here. It knows the older story it's playing against, names it explicitly, and quietly insists this version doesn't have to end the same way. Number 16. How the Beverly Wilshire sold the fantasy. On Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills, the Beverly Wilshire, already one of the city's grand hotels by the time production began, became the visible center of the film. Edward's suite, the lobby, the hallways, the front entrance with its valet stand, all anchored the picture in a real and recognizable Los Angeles. The hotel did half the selling the script needed done for it. Pretty Woman is a fairy tale set in a real city and filming inside an actual landmark, rather than building the fantasy from constructed sets, gave the romance a grounded glamour that an entirely fabricated luxury hotel couldn't have produced. Some interiors were recreated on stages, but the public-facing spaces audiences see most often are the hotel itself. Walking past the front of the Beverly Wilshire after the film came out felt, for a long time, like walking past a piece of the romance the picture had created. The Beverly Wilshire became part of the film's mythology, the kind of location people travel to specifically because of a movie. The hotel sold the dream so completely that audiences are still buying the ticket decades later. Number 17. The escargot line that crossed two films. It happens all the time. The line "Pretty Woman" gives its waiter after he catches a flying escargot mid-air during the formal dinner scene has become one of the film's most quietly remembered beats. Gary Marshall liked the gag enough that he found a way to bring it back more than a decade later with the same actor. In The Princess Diaries, the same waiter delivers a slightly different version of the moment after a glass shatters at the table, and the joke re-lands in a film aimed at an entirely different audience. The reference isn't a wink at the original escargot, it's a returning actor and a returning rhythm, slightly adjusted for a new context. Marshall's habit of carrying small details from one film into the next gave audiences a kind of running shared joke nobody had to be in on to enjoy. The escargot moment is the cleanest example of that cross-film habit, and the only reason it works in both pictures is that the line itself is gentle enough to fit either room. Number 18. Why Marshall's set felt like family. Look closely at the credits and the character actors filling out the smaller roles in Pretty Woman, and a pattern emerges that doesn't appear in most studio productions of the era. The same names keep recurring, and several of them share Gary Marshall's last name. Scott Marshall, the director's son, appears in the film. So does Tracy Reiner, his niece. Beyond family, the supporting cast leans heavily on actors Marshall had worked with for years and would continue working with afterward. Hector Elizondo plays Barney, the hotel manager, and the warmth between him and Roberts on screen comes partly from the fact that Marshall and Elizondo were already a long-running creative partnership by the time cameras rolled. The relaxed, lived-in feel of nearly every secondary scene comes from a director surrounding himself with a trusted circle and letting them work on instinct. The result is a film that feels less like anonymous studio product than its budget would suggest. Marshall's productions tended to run like extended family workshops, and that quality is one of the things audiences responded to without necessarily knowing why. Number 19. Hank Azaria's early appearance. During the scene where police step into Edward's hotel suite, the detective on screen has the kind of face that makes a modern viewer pause and rewind. It's Hank Azaria, several years before the voice work and the roles that would make him widely recognizable across an entirely different corner of the industry. The credit slips past in a few minutes of screen time, and the part itself doesn't ask much beyond the brief professional weight a detective scene needs to carry. Pretty Woman keeps producing small recognitions like this for audiences watching 20 or 30 years later. Azaria isn't a planted Easter egg or a flagged cameo. He's an actor who happened to be cast in a small part in a major film at the start of a career that would later make every early credit feel like a hidden picture. Spotting him on a rewatch is the kind of small reward the film didn't have to offer, but ended up giving anyway. Number 20. Ralph Bellamy's final performance. In 1990, Ralph Bellamy stepped onto the Pretty Woman set for what would turn out to be his last performance in front of a camera. He was 86. He had been working in pictures for nearly 6 decades, going back to the early sound era, leads, character parts, an Oscar nomination, a long career in television, the kind of resume that doesn't get built anymore. He plays James Morse, the older industrialist Edward's company is preparing to dismantle. The role is small in screen time and disproportionately heavy in what it asks of the audience. Morse is the figure who reminds Edward of who he might still become if he stops mistaking acquisition for accomplishment, and Bellamy plays him with an unhurried decency that lets the character do that work without the script needing to underline it. Watching those scenes now, knowing this was the last time Bellamy would ever step into a part on a film set, the weight settles in differently. The dignity of the performance reads as something personal. Bellamy died not long after the film opened, in 1991, and the part stands as the close of a working life that began before color was standard and ended in a glossy romantic comedy directed by Gary Marshall. The picture doesn't draw attention to it. It doesn't have to. Number 21. The 2 songs that branded the film. 2 songs did most of the heavy lifting on the soundtrack, and either one alone would have been enough to brand the film for a generation. Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman gives the picture its title, its swagger, and the rhythm under Vivian's reinvention montage on Rodeo Drive. Roxette's It Must Have Been Love gives it the emotional pop anthem audiences carried out of the theater and onto the radio for years afterward. The Orbison song earns its place twice. It's the source of the film's name itself, chosen partly because of the song, and it scores the moment Vivian moves through the boutiques, transforming herself one window at a time. The choice to anchor the film's most fashion-forward sequence to a 1964 song from a country-tinged rock-and-roll legend reads now as obvious because it works, but at the time it was the kind of cross-era pairing that could easily have felt awkward. Instead, the song's confidence gave the sequence its energy and gave the audience permission to enjoy the spectacle. The Roxette track does a different job entirely. It lifts the film's more vulnerable scenes into a register the dialogue alone couldn't reach. Together, the 2 songs gave the soundtrack a double identity, the strut and the swoon, and the film became, almost from its first weekend, as much a sound as a story. Number 22. How critics and audiences disagreed. On paper, the critical reception of Pretty Woman should have hurt the film. Reviews were genuinely divided. Some praised the warmth and the chemistry. Others attacked the fantasy directly, arguing the picture smoothed over a difficult reality and rewarded its hero too easily. The film didn't escape that argument. It sat squarely inside it. What audiences and the industry registered, separately from the critical conversation, was the performance at the center. Julia Roberts was doing something on screen that hadn't been seen in romantic comedy at that scale for a long time. Her warmth, her timing, the vulnerability she allowed the camera to see, and the way her presence pulled audiences into her corner, regardless of the script's philosophical complications, all of it added up to a star performance the more skeptical reviews couldn't argue against. The Oscar nomination for Best Actress and the Golden Globe win followed. That gap between the film as an object of critical disagreement and Roberts as a performance that simply landed became one of the defining facts of her early career. The disagreement about the picture has never fully resolved. The verdict on her in it never seriously has been in doubt. Number 23. How the box office rewrote the genre. The gap between what Pretty Woman cost and what it eventually made is large enough that the film effectively reshaped its own genre's economics for the decade that followed. Romantic comedies didn't usually do this. Mid-budget pictures didn't usually do this. The numbers tell the story plainly. The film was made for roughly $14 million, By the end of its theatrical run, it had earned around $463 million worldwide, a return well above 30 times the production budget. The picture wasn't an event film, it wasn't a sequel or an adaptation of pre-sold material. It was a romantic comedy starring an actress who was just becoming a star and a leading man whose previous decade had produced respectable rather than blockbuster results. What the result actually changed was the industry's read on Roberts. The film made her, in a way few performances have ever made an actor that quickly. The speed with which she became one of the small handful of leads who could open a film on her name alone was set in motion the weekend the picture crossed past expectations and kept going. Pretty Woman wasn't only a hit. It was a recalibration of what a romantic comedy could earn, and a launchpad for one of the most durable star careers in modern Hollywood. Number 24. Why the story survived as a musical. On Broadway in the late 2010s, the curtain went up on Pretty Woman, the musical, a stage adaptation that brought the film's story to a different medium nearly 30 years after its theatrical release. Bryan Adams and Jim Vallance wrote original material for the production rather than relying entirely on the film's iconic soundtrack, and the staging was rebuilt for live theater rather than attempting to reproduce a movie on stage. What the existence of the musical quietly says about the source is its own kind of secret. Films get adapted to the stage all the time, and most of those adaptations come and go without leaving much trace. Pretty Woman as a musical found audiences in New York, then in London on the West End, then on touring productions that have continued running. The story turned out to be portable. The fairy tale held its shape even when the original cast, the original songs, the original director, and the original aesthetic were all stripped away and replaced. The picture became something rare in the process. Not just a hit film, but a reusable story, a fairy tale audiences kept showing up for in different forms. It works on a Broadway stage for the same reason it worked on screen. The bones underneath the polish are sound, and the longing at its center is one audiences never seem to tire of meeting again. Pretty Woman has held up the way it has because it manages to be two things at once: a romantic fairy tale that recalibrated an entire genre's economics, and a heavily reshaped object, drafted from a harsher script, repositioned by a studio, softened by a director, dressed into character by a designer who fought for the choices that made Vivian readable, and performed by two leads whose pairing nearly didn't happen. The fantasy works because the work underneath it was real. The reach has only widened since. The fashion still gets imitated, the hotel still draws visitors, the songs still play, the musical still tours, and the romantic comedy template the film set running still echoes in nearly every new entry the genre produces. If you got something out of this, the like and subscribe buttons help every video find the audiences these stories deserve. And if a single one of these secrets reshaped how you see the movie, drop it in the comments below. The strangest pieces of any production almost always become someone else's favorite.